welcome to Persuasion Mastery Lesson 5. I'm Don Watkins. So, to this point in the course, we've talked about authentic persuasion versus manipulation and logical brute force. We've talked about developing clarity, both internal and external. We've talked about the context chasm and how to overcome it through understanding your audience, context bridging, and using framing in order to make a massive leap forward in our ability to bridge contexts. Then we've talked about fact-emotion integration, the use of stories in order to make your ideas clear and in order to improve your ability to appeal to emotions. And we've talked about heaven and hell narratives as a key structure for persuasion. But we still have a problem. As Stephen Pressfield puts it, nobody wants to read your shit. And, to me, this is not at all surprising. In fact, it's surprising that anybody ever reads anybody's shit because, your competition is not, somebody else writing on your topic. It's really every other potential thing they could be reading, and really it's every other potential thing they could possibly be doing. So you have to outcompete great food, friends, TV, and sex in order to convince somebody to read what you're writing. So the bar is high, and if you actually want to be persuasive, that's a bar you have to meet, because otherwise you will not even have a chance, regardless of how good everything else you're doing is. Now, I want to make a distinction here between getting attention and motivating consumption. So getting attention, this is really the study of virality. How do I get an article to take off or a video to take off and reach a huge audience? And these two, motivating consumption is, all right, once they see the piece or once they click on the video, how do I create or activate and sustain the audience's interest so that they go from the beginning to the end? And these are related, that I think if you don't have a motivated piece, you won't be able to get virality in most cases, but they are distinct, and I'll probably do a lot more on capturing attention in the future, but right now I want to focus on motivating consumption. So when it comes to motivating consumption, there's a couple errors that I think are extremely common. So one of them is just ignoring motivation altogether. This is very common among academics who are just used to saying, well, here's my topic, and I guess you should read it because I wrote it. And so here's just an example of somebody who wrote a piece on landlords, and this is how it starts out, with no indication of why we should care about landlords, what's really at stake in this for me as the reader. And so it's just ignored. It's, well, I decided as the writer that I want to write about landlords, and here we go. Another is what I call pseudo-motivation. So this is the FCC piece that I went over, I think, in lesson 2. And you see, in this first paragraph, first we just get kind of a statement of something going on in the news, and then we get this question, isn't it time to ask, how did a country that reveres free speech end up with a government agency that imposes continually expanding speech restrictions, and where will those restrictions end? And it's pseudo-motivation in that I'm trying to raise a question in the reader's mind the reader wants answered, but it's not a question the reader has. It's not a question the reader can really even understand in most cases. And so they're not going to be compelled to go on and answer that question. As we'll see, raising questions is one of the most powerful tools of motivation, but if you just assert a question that's not natural for the reader to have, and it's not a compelling one for the reader to answer, it doesn't get you anywhere. Alienating motivation. This is when, instead of motivating, we demotivate by turning the reader off. And sometimes you can have alienating motivation just from being confusing, or not. There's different ways, but a very common way is that you're non-objective, and that you, in sometimes subtle and sometimes very clear-cut, obvious ways, you say things that will that indicate you expect the reader to agree with you when the reader is not in a position to agree with you or doesn't agree with you in this case. So here I have an opening sentence where I'm talking about media consolidation, and the whole idea is that I'm going to convince the reader that media consolidation is not a problem. But I have these two underlined statements that basically assume the reader's already sympathetic with my view. I call them self-appointed consumer watchdogs, including Obama's recent pick for FCC chair. Well, self-appointed, why is that there? Is it I'm emphasizing that they're not really consumer watchdogs, they're just calling themselves that. Instantly, I'm turning a certain segment of my audience off who think, well, why do you even, what's your grudge against these consumer watchdogs? And then this is even more important. I talk about the critics of media consolidation going apoplectic. And that is a mocking, borders on insulting way to put it, which would be fine if my audience was on board. But again, the whole assumption behind this piece is that many of my readers are at most sort of suspicious of the criticisms of media consolidation, but many of them, the idea is that they think, yeah, it makes sense, and I'm going to try to convince them otherwise. And so if I'm mocking the critics who they may be sympathetic with, that's alienating, and I'm going to undercut my ability to get them to continue reading. What you really want, when you know you've achieved motivation really successfully in your piece, is that people who start reading it, if somebody comes and says, hey, honey, we got to get going, we have to get to a meeting, they can't pull themselves away and are saying 5 more minutes. That's what we want to do. That's kind of standard we're groping for in the goal of a successfully motivated piece of communication. So a good question to ask is, well, why do people consume content? Why do people read other people's stuff rather than all of the other things they could be doing? And here's kind of a simplified model of human nature that's not exactly true, but it's helpful for understanding or answering this question, and that's that people are taking action in order to get from their current state to a desired state. They're dissatisfied with where they are, and they want to be someplace better. Now, when we talk about desired state, it's their desired state where they see themselves as wanting to get to, not where you as the author want to take them. So my desired state for you could be that you think you want to master the 6 skills of persuasion, right? But that might not be your goal. Your goal might be, I want to write a book that hits the New York Times bestseller list. And I might think, no, what you really need in order to do that is the 6 skills of persuasion. But in terms of motivation, I can't motivate you with that. I have because you're going to take an action only insofar as you see it as achieving what you want, which is that best-selling book, or to be able to create YouTube videos that get a ton of views, or to be able to stop a piece of legislation from getting passed. You have your desired state, and we'll get into some more examples of what those might be, and that is why you're going to consume or not consume content. So we can think of motivation then in theory as, well, if we can activate people's dissatisfaction and then promise that by reading our piece they will gain satisfaction, now we've motivated them. And in fact, this is what really good fiction writers do. So there's an amazing piece that you should Google in the New York Times by the thriller writer of the Jack Reacher series, Lee Child, where he talks about the key tool that fiction writers use to create suspense. And it's exactly this sort of thing, which is that you promise something, you create a question, and you promise that you're going to resolve the curiosity that this question evokes, and then you withhold it and then slowly fill it in over time. And he's a really good analysis of how to do this. And I think this is really very similar to the most powerful way to motivate intellectual persuasion pieces of communication. And I want to give you some examples of people who I think do this really well. So this is from Ayn Rand. She's writing in the wake of the death of Marilyn Monroe. The death of Marilyn Monroe shocked people with an impact different from the reaction to the death of any other movie star or public figure. All over the world, people felt a peculiar sense of personal involvement and protest, like a universal cry of, "Oh no." Now notice, by the way, that this could have been alienating if that description didn't resonate with people, but I mean, this was one of her most popular pieces, so we can assume that it did. They felt that her death had some special significance, almost like a warning, which they could not decipher, and they felt a nameless apprehension, the sense that something terribly wrong was involved. They were right to feel it. Now, they were right to feel it creates a question of why were they right? And, you know, speaking for myself as a reader, like, I really want to know that, because what Ayn Rand has done is she's helped articulate and put into words her observations about the culture, observations that others probably have sensed but not put into words. And so insofar as what she says really resonates with people's experience, they're already on board. And then when she has that they were right to feel it, now I expect her to give an answer of why they're right. And so I'm going to read on because I want that answer. Here's something from Alex Epstein. Tonight show host Jimmy Fallon, a member of the Artists Against Fracking, is like many celebrities in favor of banning most fossil fuel use and using wind and solar instead. But a few years ago, when he was host of Weekend Update, Fallon made one of the best arguments ever why solar, wind, and other forms of renewable energy work very, very badly. So bam, we've created this incredible mystery. We've been sucked in by hearing about celebrity that we might find interesting, but now we have a celebrity who's anti-fracking making the case against renewables. How could that possibly be? And so we want to read on to find out the answer. Here's from something I recently wrote. Business has been attacked as greedy, but at its core, the profit motive is how we flourish. It was business, and especially large-scale industrial businesses, that lifted humanity out of eons of poverty and extended lifespans from 30 to 80. And what fueled business was each investor's, executives, and workers' greed, their desire for a better life. Today's most popular investing trend, however, is based on the surprising premise that investors and businesses have been insufficiently greedy. So again, you have this puzzle, and hopefully if I've done my work right, it's an intriguing puzzle. Like, how could an investing trend be based on the idea that investors are insufficiently greedy? And so you're essentially compelling the reader to read on. So let's try again. A core way to create motivation is you raise a question in the audience's mind that they desperately want answered and promise them a surprising but compelling answer. That's really when you've created a motivating piece. Now I want to name just a few of the different kinds of hooks you can use to do this with, and we've seen some of them. So you can tell a story. I like little kind of personal anecdotes at the beginning, particularly if they're a little bit like they seem off topic, but I can then bring them in to a different topic. But any sort of story can be used as a way to kind of draw people in and raise a question. A paradox. So this is what I was doing in the greed piece. And these aren't all mutually exclusive, but they're just at least different aspects that can be there. Paradoxes naturally create a question of how do we resolve or explain the paradox. A direct question. We've seen that this does not always work. If you ask a question that the audience does not actually have or want answered, then that's not very effective. But if it's related to a question that's on their mind that they're like Googling around for an answer to, then that can be a very powerful way to motivate, to just directly ask that question. But there's certain kinds of questions where if it's a common question, So if you're asking a kind of weird question that they're Googling around for, like if it's like, if I wanted to know, how many people with beards were on Game of Thrones, and, I find an article that starts off asking that very question, I'm going to read that article. But if the question is something that like everybody's looking for, like how to lose 10 pounds before summer, that's not going to be motivating unless I also give people a reason to think that I really do have the answer. So the motivation has to be a question that your audience already has. And if it's a common question, some reason why they should think that you actually have the answer. Analogies and thought experiments are really good. Startling facts. You can imagine just motivating a piece on climate by saying, did you know that climate has become far safer over the last 100 years? And that's a startling fact that would make me think, well, how could that be? And what does that mean? Counterintuitive claim. This is, this one is a little tricky because if your claim just sounds crazy or stupid or evil, then it's not actually motivating. But you see a lot of takes on the so-called hot takes on the internet where they basically just start with, all right, everybody's saying X, so I'm going to figure out how to say Y. And one of the reasons that, or at least non-X, and one of the reasons that happens so much is that people are interested in a counterintuitive claim, because it's like, how could you possibly defend that? So like imagine something where it said, Mr. Rogers wasn't such a great guy after all. All right? Like you're going to get a certain number of people to read on just to figure out how could somebody say something that we all know is not true. You can motivate with a new concept. So Nassim Taleb has written several books that do this, but one is Anti-Fragile, and he starts out by saying, like, look, we have a concept for fragile, we have a concept for robust, things that are hard to break, but what we don't have is we don't have a concept of anti-fragile, which is things that grow stronger from volatility. So like the more you punch it around, the stronger it gets, and yet we need that concept. Well, that's a really intriguing idea, and now I want to learn about this concept. This is also something that Malcolm Gladwell is very big on. Like the whole tipping point is I'm introducing this new concept that's going to integrate a whole bunch of observations in the world. And then finally, an incisive observation. So we also saw this in Ayn Rand's piece, where she indicates that she's going to explain why the culture was right to have a certain attitude towards Marilyn Monroe's death. But just the way she's describing what's going on in the culture and articulating what people had sensed but not really put into words, that's the kind of thing that lets you know, oh my gosh, this person is like helping me put words to my experience of the world, and that's super motivating, and you just feel like, all right, I'm in really great hands when I see somebody helping me formulate conceptually what I'm just kind of sensing going through life. How do you actually get better at motivation or figure out how to motivate your pieces? So one is just like, don't sit down and try to come up with the right one, or you can, but if you're having trouble, try brainstorming, and you want to brainstorm at least 40 possible openings. Ideally come up with 80 or 100, and again, you're not trying to make them good. You're just trying to come up with 40 to 100 possible ways that you could start your piece. Another way is to begin with the end in mind. Like if you know that the conclusion that you want to reach is X, then you could think back and think, all right, well, what question would be answered by X? And is that a question that's motivating, or is that a question I can make motivating? Is there an expectation of a different conclusion, or that I'm subverting, and how can I set that up in the beginning? The other way you can do it is you draft your piece and then think, okay, what's the best part? What's the part that like I say something really new and unexpected? And then can I begin with that? Can I just move that to the start and figure out how to do that? And so then the final thing I'll say about getting better at motivation is just pay attention to it in other writers. Pay attention when you're going about your day and you find that you're clicking on certain articles and reading them, or videos and watching them, and then you're not clicking on others. Pay attention to why you did that. Was it because it's an author I'm familiar with? Okay, in that case, the motivation issue is not a major piece. But if it's not, what was it about the headline or the description that compelled me? And then once I clicked it, how far did I read? And if I stopped reading early, what was it that stopped me? If I kept reading all the way through, what was the kind of question or other thing that motivated me to keep going through it? And so the more that you are able to put into words what you find motivating, the better you'll naturally become in your own motivations and different ideas and strategies for motivating. You'll develop those as well. So that's it for this lesson. See you next time for lesson 6, where we're going to go into how to put all these pieces together when we talk about process.